Ever get that feeling, when a song's lyrics really get to you, like right in the feels?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Makes you wonder how words strung together like that can pack such an emotional punch.
It's amazing, isn't it?
And that's kind of what we're going to be exploring today.
Consider this our deep dive into the art of poetry.
We've got a whole bunch of cool stuff lined up for you.
Yeah, we're drawing from some really accessible sources. We've got excerpts from this guide called Poetry for Grade 6.
Sounds pretty basic, right?
Well, it is, but it's also really insightful,
Huh.
and we're also tapping into all sorts of online resources that explore different poetic concepts and stuff.
And the idea here is to go beyond just like, dictionary definitions and really get a feel for what makes poetry so powerful.
Right, exactly.
Our mission, if you're joining us for this deep dive, is to really unpack the essence of poetry. Like, what is it at its core? What are the different forms it takes? And how can we even approach reading and writing poetry without, feeling totally lost?
Yeah, we want to make
Ah,
this fun and engaging for everyone.
No need to make it feel like we're back in school.
Exactly.
All right, so let's dive right in, shall we? So, what is poetry?
Good question.
Like, if you had to explain it to someone who'd never encountered it before?
Okay, well, at its heart, poetry is all about expressing yourself through language, but in a really concentrated way.
Concentrated.
Yeah, it's about conveying ideas, emotions, and even telling stories. But it's like you're using words with this heightened awareness of their power and nuance,
Like, every word matters.
Exactly. And there's this great quote from Poetry for Grade 6, actually. It says, think of it as singing with words instead of music, which I think is a brilliant analogy.
Yeah, that's really cool. So it's not just about having something to say, but about how you say it, right?
Poets are incredibly intentional about the words they choose. They pay close attention to the sounds the words make, their precise meanings, and even the rhythm that emerges when they're all put together.
It's like a musician arranging notes almost.
Yeah, there's a real musicality to it, even though it's just words on a page.
And our sources highlight that poetry can serve so many different purposes, too.
Absolutely. It's a really versatile form of art.
So it's not just one thing, it can be many things.
Right, exactly. It can be used to tell stories. It can be used to paint these vivid pictures in your mind.
Almost like word pictures.
Yes, exactly. And perhaps most powerfully, poetry can be used to express emotions in a really direct and impactful way, like feelings of joy, sorrow, wonder, you name it.
I get that. It's like, prose tells you something, but poetry makes you feel it. There's a real difference there, isn't there?
Exactly. And there's this guide that helps us distinguish between poetry and, everyday writing, like the kind we're using in this deep dive right now. It's called prose, and it's the kind of writing where sentences just kind of flow across the page, like you see in a novel or an article. Poetry is different.
How so?
It's usually organized into lines, which often don't fill the entire width of the page. And those lines are grouped into stanzas, which are kind of like the paragraphs of the poetry world.
Okay, so stanzas are like paragraphs.
Gotcha.
So that's how we can tell it's poetry just by looking at it.
Yeah, exactly. The visual layout on the page is often the first clue that you're dealing with the poem. And within this world of lines and stanzas, there are all sorts of different poetic forms, and each one has its own unique characteristics and rules.
Right, let's explore those different forms. The sources start with haiku, which I know is like that really short form of poetry, and it's from Japan, right?
Right, the haiku has a long and rich history, originating in Japan.
And I remember it's all about nature, right? Like the seasons, animals, stuff like that.
Yeah, you got it. And what's really interesting about haiku is its structure. It's incredibly strict, but it also creates this elegant simplicity.
So tell us about the structure.
Okay, so a haiku consists of just 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7, and the third line goes back to 5. 5, 7, 5.
Right, I remember that. Syllables are like the beats in a word. So elephant has 3 syllables.
Exactly. And traditionally, haiku don't rhyme. Their power lies in their brevity, in their ability to capture a fleeting moment or a sensory detail within that tight 5-7-5 structure.
It's like a tiny snapshot of a feeling or a scene almost.
Exactly, like a little window into a specific moment in time.
Okay, so that's haiku. What comes next?
Oh, limericks.
Those are the funny ones.
We
Guys.
got it. Limericks are all about humor and playfulness. They're designed to make you laugh.
And they're short too, right?
Yes, 5 lines in total. And they have a very specific rhyme scheme, A, B, 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 A. So the first, second, and fifth lines rhyme, while the third and fourth lines rhyme with each other, but with a different sound. And the line lengths matter too. The first, second, and fifth lines are longer, usually around 8 or 9 syllables, while the third and fourth lines are shorter, around 5 or 6 syllables each. This combination of rhyme and rhythm gives limericks their signature bouncy sing-song feel.
It's like a built-in beat.
Yeah.
And they always seem to tell these funny little stories that end with some kind of surprise or punchline, right?
Exactly. It's like a miniature comedic narrative, all wrapped up in 5 lines of rhyme and rhythm. Limericks are a great example of how poetry can be fun and entertaining.
Okay, so we've got structured haiku and silly limericks. What about something that gives the poet a little more freedom?
Well, that brings us to free verse. As the name implies, free verse poetry is all about breaking free from those traditional constraints, like rhyme schemes and strict rhythms. It doesn't have to rhyme, and it doesn't have to follow a set metrical pattern.
Wait, what's a metrical pattern?
It's the underlying rhythm of a poem, how the stressed and unstressed syllables are arranged. You know how we naturally say poetry with the emphasis on the first syllable? That's part of the poem's meter. And poets can create different effects by playing with these patterns. Think about the difference between the steady rhythm of a march and the more free-flowing feel of, say, jazz music. Different meters in poetry create different
Oh,
feelings.
I see. So free verse is like the jazz of poetry.
In a way, yeah. It's all about the poet's individual voice and style. They get to decide how long the lines are, how the poem is divided into stanzas, and how it looks on the page.
It's like they're painting with words on the page almost.
Absolutely. And free verse can sound really natural, almost like someone's talking to you.
So it's like spoken word, but written down.
That's cool.
Our sources mentioned a couple other forms too. What were those again?
Oh, yeah, there's the acrostic poem.
Acrostic. It rings a bell.
It's where the first letter of each line spells out a word or message when you read them vertically. So there's like this hidden element embedded in the poem. And then there's the cinquain, which is a 5-line poem that follows a specific syllable count in each line.
I think I saw an example where the pattern was 2, 4, 6, 8, 2.
That's a common one, yeah. And all these different forms show just how creative and diverse poetry can be. It's not just one thing. There are so many ways to approach it.
So it's not like there's one right way to write a poem. You've got all these options. It's like a toolbox full of different tools.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of tools, our sources also talked about poetic devices. These are like special techniques that poets use to add layers of meaning and impact to their work.
Ooh, that sounds interesting. Give us some examples. I know we talked about simile. That's the one that uses like or as to compare things, right?
You nailed it. A simile is a direct comparison between two things that are different, and it always uses the words like or as. So you might say, the stars twinkled like diamonds, or he ran as fast as a cheetah.
Those paint such clear pictures in your head, and it's because of that comparison, right? It makes it so much more vivid.
Exactly. Similes help us see things in new and surprising ways, but connecting them to something we already know.
Okay, so simile is the like or as comparison. What about metaphor? That's also a comparison, but it's a little different, right?
Yeah, metaphor takes it a step further. It's also a comparison, but it's more direct. Instead of saying one thing is like another, a metaphor says one thing is another.
So there's no like or as.
Nope. It's like you're creating this identity between two different things. For example, you might say, my chores were a mountain waiting to be climbed, or her smile is a ray of sunshine.
I get it. So in the first example, chores aren't really a mountain. It's just a way of expressing how overwhelming they feel. And in the second one, the smile isn't really sunshine.
Right, it's about conveying the feeling of warmth and happiness. And the thing is, metaphors are super powerful because they create this immediate connection in your mind. Think of how saying love is a battlefield instantly makes you think of struggle and conflict.
Whoa, yeah, that's powerful. And it's way more impactful than just saying love is hard or something like that.
Exactly. Metaphors take us beyond the literal meaning of words and help us grasp abstract ideas in a more concrete way.
Okay, so simile suggests a resemblance, and metaphor makes a stronger statement of identity. We also touched on alliteration. What was that one again?
Alliteration happens when you have words close together that start with the same sound. It usually involves consonant sounds.
Like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers.
Exactly. Tongue twisters are full of alliteration. And it's not just for fun either. Alliteration adds this musical quality to language, making it more pleasing to the ear. And it can also emphasize certain words or create a particular mood.
Right, so those are some of the tools poets have at their disposal. But our sources also discuss these foundational elements of poetry, like rhyme and rhythm, which we've already touched on a bit.
Yeah, rhyme is pretty straightforward, right? It's the repetition of similar sounds at the end of words.
Cat, hat, bat, rat, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And rhyme often occurs at the end of lines, but it can pop up in other places too. It creates a sense of musicality in a poem and can even link ideas together.
Right, like how in a song, rhyming lyrics can make it catchier. And then there's rhythm, which is like the beat of the poem, right?
That's a great way to think about it. Rhythm is all about the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line of poetry.
So it's like how we naturally emphasize certain syllables in words, but poets do it intentionally to create a specific effect.
Precisely. And rhythm can be really regular, like a heartbeat, or it can be more free-flowing, like waves crashing on the shore. And it has a huge impact on the feel of a poem.
Makes sense. So the sound of a poem is really important, but what about how it makes us see things? That's where imagery comes in, right?
Absolutely. Imagery is all about using language to create a sensory experience for the reader. It's about appealing to our five senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch.
So it's not just about telling us what something looks like. It's about making us feel like we can actually see it, hear it, smell it, even taste it.
Exactly. Our sources give this great example. The golden leaves danced in the crisp autumn breeze. It's more than just a description. It puts you right there in the scene, you know? You can almost feel the coolness of the air on your skin.
Yeah, I can totally picture that. It's like you're watching a movie in your head. Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of what poetry is and the tools that poets use, what advice do our sources have for someone who's trying to understand poetry as a reader?
Well, one key suggestion is to read a poem multiple times.
Multiple times. Why?
Yeah, it might sound strange, but hear me out. The first time you read a poem, you're just getting a feel for the overall sound and the emotions it evokes. But with each subsequent reading, you start to notice more details, you know?
Like layers of meaning?
Exactly. You start to pay attention to individual words, the way the lines are broken, the imagery. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
And I guess it's kind of like listening to a song for the first time. You might just enjoy the melody, but the more you listen, the more you start to appreciate the lyrics and the nuances of the music.
Right, exactly. It's the same with poetry.
So, multiple readings? Any other tips?
Reading a poem aloud is also a great way to experience it more fully.
Oh, yeah. I do that sometimes. It really does make a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, it allows you to hear the rhythm, to notice any rhymes or alliteration. It's like you're bringing the poem to life with your voice.
And as you're reading aloud, what should you be paying attention to?
Well, listen for words that create sensory impressions or evoke emotions. Ask yourself, what feelings does this poem stir up in me? What images come to mind as I read?
So, it's about connecting with the poem on an emotional level, not just trying to analyze it intellectually. What about the speaker of the poem? Our sources mention that too.
Yeah, it's always important to consider who's speaking in the poem. Is it the poet directly, or are they adopting a persona,
A persona.
like a character or a voice that's different from their own? And understanding the speaker's perspective, their situation, can give you clues about the poem's meaning.
Makes sense. Any other pointers on figuring out the meaning of a poem?
Well, one of the most important things to remember is that there isn't always a single right interpretation.
Really? I always feel like I'm missing something when I read poetry, like there's some secret code I need to crack.
No, your own personal response to a poem is what matters most. The feelings it evokes in you, the connections you make. Trust your own instincts.
Okay, that takes the pressure off a bit. So, read multiple times, read aloud, pay attention to your own feelings, consider the speaker's perspective. Anything else?
Don't be afraid to ask questions. What's the main idea of the poem? Why did the poet use these specific words? And try to visualize what's happening in the poem. It's almost like creating a movie in your mind.
I love that. It's like you're actively participating in creating the meaning of the poem. So, we've covered a lot about how to approach poetry as a reader. What about writing poetry? Any tips for those who are feeling inspired?
Our sources offer some really simple starting points, depending on what kind of poetry you're drawn to. If you want to try a haiku, start with observing something in nature that sparks your interest.
Like a flower or a sunset or even a spider spinning a web.
Exactly. Then try to capture that observation or the feeling it gives you in those 3 lines, remembering the 5-7 5-syllable structure.
So haiku is all about nature and that tight structure. What about limericks? How do you even start writing something funny like that?
Well, for limericks, it often helps to begin with a funny character or a silly situation. The first line should introduce them and maybe tell us where they are.
Okay, and then what?
The second line has to rhyme with the first line and add a bit more information. Then the third and fourth lines are where things start to get really funny. They're shorter lines, and they rhyme with each other, and they usually describe a funny event or action.
So it's like setting up a joke almost.
Yeah. And then the fifth line brings it all home with a punchline, and it rhymes with the first two lines.
Okay, so it's like a little 5-line comedy routine. And what if you want to write free verse, where you don't have to worry about rhyme or meter?
For free verse, it often helps to start with a topic that really resonates with you, something you feel strongly about. Then just start writing down your thoughts and feelings about it without worrying too much about the form. Once you have some raw material, you can experiment with line breaks and stanzas, seeing what looks and sounds best.
So it's all about capturing the essence of what you want to express,
Hmm.
and then you can shape it from there.
Exactly. And reading your poem out loud, especially for free verse, can be really helpful to make sure it flows naturally and conveys the right emotion.
Okay, so we've talked about how to write haiku, limericks, and free verse. What about some examples? I know our sources mention a few well-known poems that illustrate these different styles.
Yeah, they do. One example is Sick by Shel Silverstein.
Oh, I love Shel Silverstein. He's so funny.
He is, and Sick is a great example of a poem that's both humorous and relatable, and it uses rhyme and rhythm in a really clever way.
It's one of those poems that just sticks with you.
Totally. Another example is from A Railway Carriage by Robert Louis Stevenson. This one's all about imagery and rhythm, and it makes you feel like you're actually on a train journey watching the world whiz by.
I can almost hear the train wheels clacking on the tracks.
Exactly. And then there's Dreams by Langston Hughes. This one's really powerful. It uses simple language and metaphors to explore the importance of dreams and how they give us hope. So these examples show how different poets use different techniques and styles to create different effects and convey different messages.
It's like seeing the principles we've been talking about in action. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm sure some of our listeners might still have some questions about poetry. Like, what's the point of it all?
That's a really common question, and the answer is it depends. Poetry can be used for so many different things.
Like what?
Well, it can be a way to express your deepest feelings, to share your unique perspective on the world, to tell stories, to explore complex ideas.
It's not all about rhyming love poems, then.
No, not at all. Poetry can be funny, serious, thought-provoking, heartbreaking, anything. And another question we often get is, does all poetry have to rhyme?
And what's the answer to that one?
Nope, definitely not. We've already talked about haiku and free verse, which don't typically rhyme.
So rhyme is optional. Got it. What about understanding the meaning of a poem? That can be tricky.
Yeah, it can. And one of the things our sources emphasize is that there's not always a single right answer when it comes to interpreting poetry.
So it's not like a math problem with one correct solution.
Not at all. Poetry is more about individual interpretation. It's about how the poem makes you feel, what it makes you think about.
That makes it more personal, I guess.
Exactly. And your understanding of a poem can even change over time, depending on your own life experiences. So if you read a poem and you're not sure what it means, that's okay. Just trust your gut feeling. What emotions does it evoke? What images come to mind? Those are all valid responses.
That's a really great way to approach it. And lastly, a question that a lot of people might have is, can anyone write poetry?
Absolutely. Poetry is for everyone. It's a wonderful way to express yourself creatively, to play with language, to connect with your inner world. And if you're interested in exploring poetry further, our sources suggest checking out poetry books, online resources, and even asking your local librarian for recommendations. They can point you in the right direction. And one last bit of advice. If you're feeling stuck when writing your own poems, don't be afraid to experiment, to make mistakes, to have fun with it.
It's the journey, not the destination. So, to wrap things up, what have we learned today?
Well, it seems like poetry is this incredibly diverse and accessible art form that allows us to express ourselves and connect with the world around us in unique and powerful ways.
Yes, it's not just for academics or literary experts. Poetry is for everyone.
So as we go about our days, maybe we can start to see the world with a more poetic lens, noticing the beauty in everyday things, the rhythm of our lives, the power of words to move and inspire us.
That's a beautiful thought. And maybe, just maybe, we'll even feel inspired to create our own poems, to share our own voices and experiences with the world. That's something to think about.
Definitely. And who knows, maybe we'll even be back with another deep dive into the world of poetry soon. There's always more to explore.
Until then, happy reading and writing.